Coming up on this episode.
It's kind of like the Marine Corps recruitment poster, right? Like pain's weakness leaving the body, right? Well, so you have no weakness anymore.
And when back to the pain is weakness leaving the body, how many people feel like they need to suffer in silence because they believe that suffering through it is actually the strong, more brave way to do it?
That's what ends up in the we all know how that ends, because it's not healthy. It took me years to want to admit that there was something there that wasn't there before, that I needed to go talk to somebody and hash some stuff out.
Low pass, short force confirmed that the enemy.
Outside the wire.
All right, so welcome to another episode of Outside the Wire podcast. We have a special guest again, Chris, with us from KBarSoap. And Chris is the owner of KBarSoap. He's a Marine, joined 2000 and did the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003. And he's going to give us a little book report today. And welcome back to the show, Chris.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me.
Let us know what you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so the reason for this one, and we all reach these points in our lives, and basically, whether we're getting help from the VA or whether it's self-help, that you have like an enlightening moment when something just kind of clicks and you figure something out, right? So we all spend a lot of the time, I feel like, after combat and after trying to find our own sense of normalcy. One of the things that I found every time that I went to talk to somebody or to try to get help was how much we struggle with basically empathy, thinking about others more so, and vulnerability is like the number one I kept hearing is you need to learn how to be vulnerable to help that transition. But that's not ever what we were taught, to be vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. From boot camp till the time you EAS'd, you're never to be vulnerable. Always watch your six, all the stuff, right? And some of those things are good, but a lot of them are stuff that we can just kind of let go and try to realize that we are now kind of in a safe space, right? Kind of a safe zone in America. We don't have all the time worry about somebody around the corner trying to snipe you. So, and just kind of let that stuff go, because it can impact the rest of your life. So throughout the research, we got to talking about it. And one of the books that I found that helped was this Daring Greatly. I'll show it to everybody if you can see it there, by Brene Brown. And I'll show it on here too. And so what this does is basically goes through and breaks down shame, how we treat it, how we tend to process it, and how we tend to basically guard ourselves from vulnerability and shame throughout every facet of our life, whether it could be parenting, whether it be relationships, anything. And how I wanted to start with it, there's the 14 leadership traits we learned in the Marine Corps, right? The whole JJ did tie buckle. There's no V in that, right? And there's no V in that for vulnerability for a reason, because you can't be that. But that's all fine and dandy when you're in, and it's you against the enemy, and you're in this alpha male, let's beat each other's ass constantly kind of environment, right? That's just what we're all accustomed to. But that's not what's going to get you through day-to-day life, working, having to take orders from somebody you may or may not respect, which in a boss or whatever. So it's really just about opening up and trying to figure out how to get rid of some of the bad and keep the good. Excuse me, I got to go through some notes. I can't remember this whole book.
Right, no, it's fine. And it's interesting because you have the basic fears or what men would consider weakness versus what women would consider weakness. And I've heard this before, that women fear physical harm, where men fear ridicule. And so vulnerability for men versus women can be different, and individuals can be different. And what you talked about, the Marine Corps is constantly pounding into your head, cover, concealment, watching your six. You always got intersecting fields of fire.
Yes.
You're always watching each other's back. And when you're in combat, fear is looked at as a weakness, and vulnerability is the the same thing as fear, or not the same thing as fear, but a weakness. And
It is.
and I remember, so I started listening to this book, knowing that you were going to do this podcast about it. And one of the things that popped out was Brene Brown talked about how people equate vulnerability as a weakness. And because vulnerability is equated to emotions, then people equate emotions as a weakness. So feeling something is a weakness. And this book basically talks about how that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Now it starts out with because about shame, and it goes through and digs into shame, and it's something that all of us experience, whether it comes down to our appearance. So we see all these cats that kept up with their body, they're in like banging shape, like, damn, I wish I'd have kept up with mine. How much money you make, your title at work, always feeling inadequate in some way, shape, or form, how you parent, how you treat your spouse. So in a lot of ways, after somebody that's been through an experience like a lot of us have, when we feel ashamed, we try to check out mentally and emotionally to protect ourselves. It's a disconnection strategy to protect ourselves and move away, and so we don't feel the shame, right? So have you found any of that stuff? Like, I know I've struggled with it a lot before, just feeling like I don't make enough money, or I'm not doing enough good, and not being who I need to be as a parent. I don't know. It's constantly evolution.
Oh yeah, totally. I've felt the same thing. It's shame is probably one of my biggest areas that trigger me to an emotional response. If someone mentions something that they disagree with what I did, and it makes me feel any hint of shame, my response is one of to protect myself. And the only way I know how to protect myself is to
Get angry.
I'm trying to think of the word, overcome with superior firepower, which is,
It's not always the best.
It's aggression. It's aggression. And aggression, when you're dealing with a basic interaction with someone, is not very, very rarely is it the right response or a healthy response.
It's one that'll get you in trouble now too, right? I mean, we can't treat every situation like we talked about, had the road rage conversation. You can't treat that like you're, back in the sandbox, and like it has to be, some point you have to think about who's going to come on, who's going to be the bigger person, who's going to come out on the top side of that. You lose your cool, you're going to end up with charges, whatever may happen. There's a lot of different stuff that can happen to you. So you can't treat every situation like that. The whole fight or flight stuff needs to, I don't know. I think we need to try to do a little bit more flighting than fighting at some point.
Right. Yeah.
But one of the quotes that kind of stood out to me that for the most part is, I'm not what has happened to me, I'm what I choose to become. So I feel like a lot of, not a lot, some choose to use the fact that they've saw bad shit, they did whatever at such a young age, and they use it as a crutch their entire life. Now, a lot of us try to use it as, because if we went through something that young and made it through it, we were one of the ones lucky enough to make it through it. We have a lot to live for and a lot to be proud of. And it's not something to look back on and, hate what you did. You did a job, good, bad, or indifferent. And that was a period of your life. It doesn't define the rest of your life. And I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I don't know. I think it's hard for me to not. I know a lot of our decisions are made based off of that time in our life. So having it not 100% define us is a challenge.
Yeah, 100%. Well, if you look at when guys like us deploy, it's at a lot of us very young age. A lot of us haven't done anything that extreme or of that importance before. So you don't have a lot before or after to compare that to. Like, I graduated high school, then joined the Marine Corps, then deployed to combat. Like, what before combat do I have to identify with? You know what I mean? My high school career as a punk, You know,
Work experience, no nothing to fall back on, right?
yeah, nothing. So it's when you have something that major in your life, yeah, it's no wonder that you go back to or identify as that. And the other thing that's interesting too, and you mentioned, where you talk about like the VA and the vet centers, the vet center, in my opinion, has a very antiquated style of providing counseling for veterans. And I don't know, they might be progressing and there might be other counselors that are doing something completely different. But the ones that I went to, the immersion therapy or whatever, you go back to the source of the trauma and you talk about what happened to you and you almost kind of dwell on it, where
Yeah.
some of the other counseling sessions that I got outside the VA were more like what you described as picking a point of where you want to be and focusing on that, focusing on where you want to go instead of focusing on where you were and focusing on the bad that happened to you. And because you're not that one moment in your life, you are where you are currently, and you can decide. I was in Iraq in '04, so that's 16 years ago. I am not that person anymore currently. I am somebody completely different because I'm doing things that are completely different. I haven't fired a machine gun at anyone in a long time.
Yeah.
So I'm,
And had you stayed in, it would have been normal, right? If we were
Right.
still both in, everything we went through would be normal, right? Everything we'd be feeling, we probably wouldn't realize we had a problem because we're still in that environment, or that we had issues with it because we're still in an environment to where that's that's commonplace.
One of the quotes that when I was listening to Brene Brown talking about the book, she asks people what their definition of vulnerability is, and they gave a bunch of descriptions, and then she asks them again to describe what those things were and what they sounded like. And the things that they described were, it sounds scary to them, but when they describe someone who does it, like let's say for me, starting a podcast and talking about my personal stuff that I'm struggling with was scary. But then I saw people that were doing it and how much they were helping people. And when I saw what they were doing, I didn't see it as something scary. I saw it as something courageous. So when you look at vulnerability, it's not something that's scary. It's something that when you do it is brave. And I liked that she broke it down and said it that way. And it just makes it, when you talk about vulnerability and your path to getting better, it's really hard to make progress with this kind of stuff if you're not being willing to be open and real and honest and do things that feel uncomfortable and are a little bit scary to talk about. On the last podcast I was talking with Chad, we talked about if you put two combat veterans side by side, or any combat veteran, you ask them, would you rather stack next to a door with bad guy, there's bad guys in there, and enter that room, or sit in a room with a counselor and talk about your feelings? And we were laughing because
That's easy.
I promise you, almost all of us would say, give me a rifle, put me on that door, I'm breaching. I would rather do that because I know what I'm getting into. And the other thing, if you think about it, why are you more brave or conditioned or ready to do something like that versus sit and talk about your feelings? Well, the reason is because you trained to do that.
The time.
You've built that confidence in your abilities and yourself to do something that to anyone else would be super scary. But because you've trained and you've practiced and you've thought it all through and you've considered every scenario and you know what's going to happen, and if you take fire, what happens next. But when you go into a counseling session or you talk about problems and you start to work through it, you don't know what happens next because nobody's taught you how to do that. Nobody's told you what happens next. And one of the quotes that Brene Brown talks about too is she talks about being halfway across a tightrope,
Yep.
and now you're in the middle of it. Do you, like, you're halfway across? It's just as scary to go back as it is to push forward. But what happens when you go back? Not where you want to be, but if you go forward, get to where you want to go and keep pushing through. And she said that, let's see if I can find my notes here. The willingness to show up changes us, and you become braver each time. So every time that you expose yourself to a little bit of vulnerability, you build some more confidence. You expose yourself to that area of where you're not comfortable, and you get through it and you realize, oh, that wasn't so bad, or oh, there was value in doing that, and then it's worth doing it again, and that's where you make progress.
Yeah, well, and growth occurs during uncomfortable times, right? That's the only time growth can occur, in my opinion. You need to be uncomfortable for growing to, I don't know, to manifest, because that's how you learn. Brought up a good point too, but a lot of that, I think it's hard for people transitioning, getting out, to focus on themselves, because I don't know about you, but I didn't necessarily do anything over there for myself, if that makes sense. You do it for the guy to your left and to your right, and for what's waiting on you at home. And I think whenever you get back, your brothers go their own ways. They go back home to Mississippi or wherever, Virginia, and then you're left with just you to focus on, right? And I think that's, I don't know, I think that's a whole different avenue. I mean, do for yourself what you would have done for your brothers, right? You owe it to yourself. And you owe it to the people that didn't make it back to live, but you know, live with some sense of compassion with other people, and I don't know, just not be angry all the time, because I struggle with it. I struggle with it a lot, without a doubt. Just pissed off for no apparent reason.
Well, you said a lot of good stuff in there. Living for the guys that we left behind, because I lost one really close friend, and a lot of, we lost 12 other Marines when we deployed, and one right before we deployed. And yeah, I think about that all the time. Like, those guys, I want to make sure that what they died for was meaningful. I don't want their passing to be worthless. I don't want them, they wouldn't want to look down on me and say, like, this guy made it through combat, but then lived a shitty life the rest of his life. Like, that's an awful. And I think another thing, when you talk about your buddies while you were over there, and then your support system when you come back, it is really hard to be on your own. It is really hard to not be around other people that you can relate to. And you were in a combat zone. You had 20 other guys right there with you doing the same thing. So even though you were possibly scared shitless to be going on the next combat patrol, you had that support system, knowing that everyone else was feeling the exact same thing. And you didn't have to talk about it. We never said, oh my God, are you scared? You don't talk about it. But you know that they're feeling what you're feeling, and they're going to go anyway and do it. And to have that when you're there is so important. But when you don't have it back home, you can definitely feel very alone, and it can be very scary to try to do this stuff on your own, not knowing that everybody else is going the same thing. And that's another huge reason why this podcast was something important to me to start, is because I believe that I was missing out on that. And I know other guys are missing out on that, to share what I'm thinking and have guests, have you come on and share what you're thinking, and have other guys relate and realize that we're all dealing with very similar stuff, and that it's okay, and that there's help, and there's people making progress, and here's what they're doing to make progress. It's very important to get that information out and share it, and have people exposed to it. And one of the things that, we talk about vulnerability, when you think about the people that you've become close with since you've been out, you've got your buddies that are fun. They're a lot of fun to hang out with. They make the jokes that make you laugh. They do the things that you like to do, and you have those similar interests. But how connected and how well do you think you know them if they don't share what's really going on? Like, how many times have you been out with buddies, and then all of a sudden they say something that kind of like throws you off a little bit and be like, wait, there was something more to that. Like you just said something that could mean that you're actually dealing with something real, but he's putting on a show. How well can you know these buddies if they're not telling you everything that's going on? And then we wait until this point of it's catastrophic. You know, there's so much going on in this guy's life that you don't know about and he's not telling you about. And then when he finally does tell you, it feels too overwhelming for you to do anything to help him. You can't just take him out for a beer and have him work it out with you. It's at this point, it's like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like I had no idea that you were drinking or dealing with that much. Had he been able to be more trusting and more vulnerable with you, maybe you guys could have figured out a better friend when it was a smaller issue, when he had one thing going on versus his whole life was falling apart. And the guys that I've met recently, you know, I've got a couple buddies that are that surface level friend where, you know, we go out for a beer and
Have a good time.
Yeah, have a good time, but you don't really know that guy. He's fun to hang out with. But then I've got the guys who are comfortable in sharing real shit.
Yeah.
And talking about real stuff. And I may have spent less time with those guys than I have this other friend who's fun to hang out with, but I feel much closer to that guy. I feel more empathy. I feel more willing to put effort into helping that guy if he needs it because he's been vulnerable and I feel like he's trusted me with information and I feel like I can trust him if I'm in need. And so, you know, Brene Brown talks about that, that how close can you feel to someone if you're not actually being vulnerable?
Yeah. Well, you brought up trust too. Like that, I think that's a huge thing we have. I don't know that I deal with is trusting people. Like not everybody's out to get me, you know, all this other stuff. Trust has been something that I've struggled with. I trust my brothers, but then there's a small group that I trust. And then everybody else, I kind of keep at arm's length. I got my personal space, you know? I don't know, but to me, like that's still a sign of weakness. Like you're not putting yourself out there enough and, to trust people, to be vulnerable to other people that you just met. Yeah. So like she goes on, and one of the things it says, men live under the pressure of one unrelenting message: do not be perceived as weak. And then so for those of us that serve, that's obviously been exacerbated. So you don't want to be perceived as weak in the rear, in combat, in boot camp, anywhere. So it's all, you have to be alpha, and that is it. Like that's the only way we're going to ever get along. And so let's see. Now that since it's intensified, that translates into our experience is basically, lack of a better term, not being a pussy. You don't want to be perceived as that. And no matter what you do, you're going to, that's going to be the line you toe no matter what. Right. Yeah. So no crying, no anything that is perceived that way. Right. Never show weakness. It's kind of like the Marine Corps recruitment poster, right? Like pain's weakness leaving the body. Right. Well, so you have no weakness anymore.
And it went back to the pain is weakness leaving the body. How many people feel like they need to suffer in silence because they believe that suffering through it is actually the strong, more brave way to do it?
That's what ends up in the, we all know how that ends because it's not healthy. It took me years to want to admit that there was something there that wasn't there before, that I needed to go talk to somebody and hash some stuff out. To me, this is me being vulnerable left and right, doing this in a public forum, admitting some of my faults, right? Because, I mean, it's huge, same way you mentioned earlier, right? Yeah. So that means something's happening. Something's happening good anyway. Basically, vulnerability is kind of letting the asshole leave your body, like in layman's terms, right? Just let a little bit of that go. And just see what kind of relationships you can build by letting your guard down a little bit. I mean, we're not in Iraq, we're not in Afghanistan anymore. There's very little people that can do with words that can hurt you or anything like that, right? You may piss you off, but I mean, I don't know. Give people a shot somehow.
Well, and you talk about being a pussy versus what's the opposite of being a pussy, being a badass. Well, what's more badass? Someone who deployed to combat, you know, went toe to toe with the bad guys, did what he had to do, came home, you know, a chest full of ribbons. And that guy then, now he enters the disgruntled, angry veteran cliche. And is it more badass to be that guy who can't spend time with his wife or his family because everything pisses him off? He can't hold a job because he's constantly losing his shit all the time. Is that badass? He's going to bars and he's getting into fights. He's dealing with road rage. Is that badass? Or is the guy who became very mindful and faced his demons, educated himself on how to deal with it, and has all those medals hanging on the wall and is proud of them, but at the same time can live a very balanced, real, healthy life with very close people? And I think that is way more badass than holding all your emotions in and not dealing with them ever.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And we talked about this on the phone the other day. I think I would love to start shifting the culture of combat veterans to, instead of romanticizing the disgruntled veteran and romanticizing the resilient warrior, the guy who can flip it on when he needs to and can be deadly, but can also be very gentle and kind and be warm and real and have real meaningful life with a family and kids and hold a good job. And that's what I think we should strive for as veterans, is to be that guy.
100%, but still know how to be violent if it ever comes up, right? That's important too. Still know how to protect your family, but don't treat every situation like that. Don't put fight or flight in front of every situation you come to. It does not always have to be one way or the other. Now, to protect your kids and everything, to do what's right there. Yeah, you know how to do it, but we always talk about the switch. Like once you flip the switch on, it's 10 times harder to pull that switch down. It's 10 times harder to turn it off than it was to turn it on through those 3 months of Paris Island or San Diego. Like that switch was flipped, and you'll spend years trying to turn it off. And but it's no way to live. Living angry all the time, living pissed off. It's taken me a long time to realize that. I mean, hell, next month is my retirement date. I joined in April of 2000, so I think about it all the time. I'd be out and hit my 20. Well, who knows if I'd be getting out at that point, but
yeah, mine was last October. So
was it?
I had that same, went through that same, man, why did I get out?
I know. Because I don't feel as old as some of those gunnies looked, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the gunnies at 20, I'm like, damn, he looked like he was 60 years old. But, I don't know. I know it's hard on your body after doing 20 years in there, but I don't know. But end all say all, like this book has got so many different tidbits. I could sit here and talk about it, all the time, but it's got so many things that you may not think that she can relate to, but she figures out a way not to just talk to veterans, but as a population as a whole. It's kind of just the mechanisms that we build in ourselves to prevent having to deal with this, rather than just to deal with it, rather than just put it out there.
Yeah, the cool thing is, so the author of the book is Brene Brown, and the name of the book is Daring Greatly. And she got the title of the book from a quote from April 23rd, 1910, from President Roosevelt. And the quote is called "The Man in the Arena." And it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong the man stumbles, or how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end of the triumph high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And I think that has got so much awesome one quote, but has so much in it. And that last sentence talking about daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And it's a powerful statement, and that's what she based her book on. And when you either read the book or listen to the podcast or listen to the audiobook or even follow her on Instagram, again, her name is Brene Brown. She does a really good job relating everything to a personal. She'll tell you about her personal life and her personal experiences and how hard it is. It's not like she's teaching from a place of a higher level where she's talking down on you. She's like, this is the crap that I lived through and learned the hard way and realized, like, and she spent a lot of time interviewing people, researching, and really figuring out the truth and then talking about it and how important it is. And it's just great. One of the things that you talked about too was talking about trust and knowing what level of vulnerability you don't want to just dump everything out there. And I don't know if you remember in this book, she talks about the people who are almost, they're attention seekers, and they will almost drive past that point of vulnerability into a place where they're just spilling everything. And that's definitely not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the guys who complain about everything or the people who just dump all their emotions out everywhere, because then you almost become, it's hard to be empathetic to people like that because you're putting all your problems out on someone else. And that's not what she's talking about here. She's talking about being real, being honest, and sharing how you feel in a moment. Where, and I've learned in so many scenarios recently, where you, my wife and I like to have after action reports. If you ever got into a little scuffle with her, in the moment, it's hard to articulate what you're thinking or feeling. And if you just, let's say you get in a fight with your wife and then you just let it be, and then you like to do what I like to do, where you just play it off and act like it didn't happen.
Just let it go.
Yeah. But you would expect, you said the nasty things and you just want her to let it go. But it doesn't work that way, right? You hurt her feelings. And honestly, she probably hurt your feelings. She might not have hurt your feelings intentionally. Maybe she hit that shame button or said something that made you feel ridiculed, and that's what caused you to react the way you did. And of course, because she caused you to feel that way, it's her fault, and you're going to let her have it. But these are all things that I think guys and anyone who's in a relationship can probably relate to this in some level. But
Yeah.
what we do is, once we've had a moment to reflect, I try to, and we both do this, we'll try to be vulnerable and say, hey, I realized later, I'm sorry that I kind of overreacted. But what you said made me feel like you didn't trust me, or made me feel like you're treating me like one of the kids, or, these things that for a man, like, I don't want you to group me in with the kids. Like, she might say, stop leaving the toilet seat up, or why didn't you take out the trash, or whatever, a wife might say to a husband. And if my wife said that to me, then I would be like, why are you treating me like one of the kids?
Like a kid.
And that triggers my ego. And then I react by yelling at her and getting angry. Well, then because I reacted and yelled and got angry with her, now I've hurt her feelings. And if she gets defensive, then that's how it spirals
Then it
upward.
escalates. It's going to continue.
Escalation. Yeah. So if you can find that moment where you pause and reflect and enter that vulnerable, where if she says something to you, and instead of you reacting, and you enter that vulnerable reaction or response versus reaction, and you say, hey, when you said that, it actually it kind of hurt my feelings, and it kind of bruised my ego a little bit. And it's hard for me to admit to you that what you said bruised my ego. But if you've got a wife that truly cares about you and really is interested about being connected with you. And if you said something try saying something like that to next time you get into a little scuffle, and try that versus yelling at her and see what kind of crazy response. It's going to blow your mind. She's going to be like super empathetic and you'd be like, oh, and she's like, I didn't know that the way I said that made you. I didn't know I could hurt your feelings. I didn't know I could hurt your feelings. I thought you were this big tough guy.
Yeah.
I thought you had two emotions, happy and mad. But now I realize that this is why you get mad. Now you've given her some information about yourself and she has something to do with it. Like she can navigate your emotions better because now
work with it.
Yeah. And
yeah,
you're building a connection. You're getting to know each other better. And yeah, it's you're showing your underbelly a little bit. You're showing your weakness. You're admitting that a certain thing that she might say hurts her feelings. And it's vulnerable. But by being vulnerable and sharing that information with her, you're letting her get to know you better. And unless, I would say 99% of the time, if you did that with your wife or girlfriend, that they would, if they knew that about you, hopefully they wouldn't use that as ammo against you to, hurt your feelings intentionally. But if you're in a situation where you're married to or dating someone who's intentionally using your vulnerabilities against you, then you should probably get out of that relationship. Yeah, well, that's awesome. Yeah. Um, and when you talked about the going to a restaurant, sitting with your back to the door, that consistent behavior is what actually reinforces those fears. So if your fear is being exposed in a public place, that fear may not be warranted. It may be, depending on where you are, but chances are it's not. It's more of a learned behavior due to a trauma and trauma can be anything. She talks about trauma in the book. But if you consistently build those habits to reinforce your fears, then you're never going to get past those fears. The same thing with feeling vulnerable. If I continue to react in a way that protects my vulnerabilities in a conversation with my wife, then all I'm doing is reinforcing that boundary and never getting past it and never growing or getting to where I can heal or get better or learn a new skill.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know. So maybe we try to, you know, baby step things with people like that to be vulnerable, because I don't think, I don't know. I don't know how I want to say it. But try to sit with your back towards the door one time and see how it ends up. You know, try it. Just try it one time. If it's something like that, just test it. It's nothing more like, if you're scared of heights, you keep going on a roof, you're gonna get used to them eventually, right? Like, so it's just facing those fears somehow, because living with that level of hypervigilance is freaking exhausting.
It is very exhausting.
So little baby steps to it. So next time you go eat with your spouse, with your family, whoever it may be, try sitting with your back towards the door. See if everybody turns out all right, right?
Yeah. And if you in the relationship side, if you know that something, and these are things that you have to be aware. You have to be aware enough of where you are in your life, and you have to be aware to say, like, hey, I keep doing this thing and it's not getting me anywhere better. It keeps getting me to the same exact point and I don't like it. So you have to be aware that what you're doing is causing harm or holding you back. So you have to say, like, I want to not have these things trigger me, and I want to move past it and grow and get better. What you just described is actually called dialectical behavior therapy, or exposure therapy. And what it is just like training in the military, you identify a skill that you have no skill in, something that you want to get better at, and you don't go all in. You give yourself bite-sized doses, something that you can manage, and it should make you feel uncomfortable. If you wanted to be better in the PFT, you would have to push yourself to run faster. You can't keep running the same speed and then one day have a better PFT score. You have to push yourself to a little bit of where you're actually working hard. And this is the same thing with this kind of emotional vulnerability. Like, you're gonna feel uncomfortable. It's gonna suck a little bit, but don't make it suck to the point where you want to give up. Make it suck to the point where you look back when you got through it and you're like, hey, that felt good to look back and say I did it. And then it makes you want to do it more. So definitely only expose yourself to what you believe or you know that you can handle, and build that confidence, basically.
Yep, absolutely. And then lean on your buddies too. Lean on your brothers, without a doubt. So,
is there anything you want to wrap up with?
let's see. I don't know. I've got a lot more notes written on this book, like wrote down, but we don't need to go into anything of that. It goes on into parenting and how what we do and what we've been through and how we treat vulnerability even can transcend into how we treat our children. Not talking physically. I'm just talking about how we react to issues that come up with our family. And it's largely eye-opening that some of the things that we do that we think is normal is definitely not normal. Definitely not how we should interact. We expect a certain amount of things from our kids, but we have to realize that they're still kids at the end of the day, right? They still allowed to make mistakes.
Well, I think relationships with our spouses could be a whole nother podcast. I think relationships with our kids could be a whole nother podcast. And if you want to do that, I'd love to have you back, and we'll do those too.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to spread the word, like, about this book. If there's anybody out there that feels like that they may be resisting going and get some help, you can go on Amazon. This book is like $15. If you don't want to go to the VA, don't want to admit weakness that way, Amazon will ship it in a discreet little package, and you can read it on your lunch break. Nobody will have to know, and then maybe it may open your eyes to some of the BS you're doing that you don't even realize you're doing.
And I encourage you to find other people that are doing the same thing, because if you can find somebody you relate to and find somebody that's doing it too, it's definitely helpful to kind of do it together. Doing it alone is tricky, and that's why this podcast, again, we started, is to show guys that this is what we're doing. I think it's awesome that you said that you wanted to do this book report, because I hadn't read the book yet, but my wife told me I should. And I think it's cool that you read the book, because now it makes me feel like, oh, okay, it's okay to read a book that a woman wrote about emotions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I give you a lot of credit, because that's took bravery on your part to read the book, and it took a lot more bravery for you to be willing to share what you learned on this podcast, and to, however many people we got.
And I found it by Googling the best book about how to be empathetic. And it came up, and I started researching books, and that one come up, and it was all happenstance. And I was like, you know what? That's one of the things I struggle. I'm going to read it. And I swear it's been probably the best thing that ever happened. I'll never get rid of that book, because I'll probably reference stuff all the time. But yes, for sure. But yeah, I'll do a different one on whatever. We can keep going on, because it does me some good to talk about it too, because I don't always practice what I preach. So
oh yeah. To jump back in, have you noticed we did a podcast, episode number 6 was about road rage. After doing that podcast, did you notice anything different? Did you try any new skills that we talked about?
I did, but I'll tell you, I started to go down my traditional path, and I was like, whoa, I've got new tools in the toolbox. Let me go pick one of those out. And I was like, there he is. I'm just gonna let him go on by. And no, but it gives me different thinking points. Instead of just thinking that this is how I've always been, I'm just going to continue this. It helped me, like, well, let's try it a different way and see if I can show back up home in a better mood.
Yeah. The very next day I was sitting in traffic, and I had so many moments where I was like, oh, and I was like, same thing. We practiced, and it got me to my destination safe and sound, and I was much better off for it. So I agree. I think these podcasts are great for other people to listen to, but they've been super beneficial to myself, beneficial to the people that have been on the podcast. And again, that's why it's just, to me, it's like one of those things where the more I do, the more excited I get. So I definitely want you to be a regular guest on and I didn't even call you a guest, just a member of the show. Like you're one of us. You're a Marine, you're a combat veteran, you're one of the guys. So you are owner of KBar Soap. Tell us really quickly about your company and where people can find you.
Oh, I just, man, I wasn't even prepared to do that. I was all on the whole healing phase. So KBarSoapCo, make all natural grenades of showering freedom for your showering enjoyment. Make showering great again, and it's KBarSoapCo.com.
And you're on Instagram as well, right?
Yeah, KBarSoapCo and Facebook, and I dabble in Twitter and all this other what is it, TikTok now? That's the funniest thing ever. And me being on TikTok is a little bit of an, I don't know, it's very weird, but it's something fun to mess with. But yeah, that's it for sure.
Well, I'll wrap up the podcast, and I'll chat with you more offline here after this. But thanks again for coming on, and looking forward to having you on the next one.
Yeah, brother. Thanks for having me.
This episode Outside the Wire podcast is brought to you by leatherneckforlife.com, 100% made in the USA apparel for Marines. We just launched our new website. It's called theenlistedclub.com. All of our podcasts will be available on that website and in a blog format, so it'll have a comment section. So you can go ahead and, if you like one of the specific episodes and you want to share some feedback, jump on theenlistedclub.com, find the podcast, and then give us your feedback, comment, ask questions, let us know what you think we should talk about next. Or if you have an interesting story or an awesome resource that you want to share, let us know and we'll have you on the show. Again, that is theenlistedclub.com. Thanks for watching.
Mayhem, this is Bravo 67 QRF. We are moving to contact exit gate 2. We are Oscar Mike.